This week in Humanities 101, we're going to put our toe in the water, so to speak, of the vast ocean of the subject of music. Now, in our text, they start with making a distinction between hearing and listening. And I think that's a wonderful thing to explore before we delve into all the different kinds of music and some of the ways that music can influence our lives. We can hear as we hear a background tone, or as you just kind of have music as a fabric, as a weave behind daily life. Or we can listen, and in listening, then the listener makes distinctions between which instruments are playing, maybe even determining if it's in a minor key or a major key, or when the song is actually shifting keys. The listener might also determine the rhythm. Is it in a 4-time, 1, 2, 3, 4? Is it in a waltz time or a 3-time, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3? Those kinds of distinctions can be found by deep listening. Often today, music is heard through headphones, and that really allows the opportunity for deep listening. But listening is really a skill that might need to be focused on in order for it to become a habit. I've made the choice to talk to you about music, which is it's kind of a contradiction in its own right, because there's only so much that can be said, and then really music is about listening. But after reading the chapter this week, there were some things that came up that I wanted to present as possible ways of looking at this subject. Your chapter spends a good deal of time talking about music from the point of view of notation, of an overview of classical music, which can be so valuable. I do feel that in our chapter there is a little bit too much weight given to Western classical music, and international music is not really mentioned. So we'll remedy that in the videos and in some of the things that we'll be looking at in this week's lesson. One distinction that I do want to make also from the chapter is that it presents the musical scale in the form of a piano keyboard. Now, I'll just, as with full disclosure, I'll tell you that I have been playing music my whole life, that I learned to read musical notation as I learned to read ABCs. I had a little coloring book that had the notes in it. So notation is a language that I'm familiar with. However, as a musician, I've had to sometimes let go of the notes in order to get to the sound. And what I mean by that is that it's very valid to learn music from notes. In fact, even jazz musicians, they read these elaborate charts, but then they leave the notes behind and they improvise. As musicians, we can draw from our right nonverbal brain, which does not read notes, or we can depend on notation, which can also be a beautiful doorway into the world of music. This other non-linear, non-verbal approach to music, which is brought forth in the Suzuki training method, which teaches students to play by ear before they learn to read notes. It's also something that groups of musicians do quite a bit. A person can learn ear training, so you can learn the different tenor, the different aspects of each note. How is a C different than a G, for example? And how do you feel and sense a minor key, even if you're not a musician? One way that musicians do this is they share a common language of chords and of simple progressions. And this is covered in your book, but even as a musician, I found myself getting a little bit tangled in the explanation provided. So here's another explanation. For a chord, a musician might walk into a circle that's going to jam and say, okay, A minor. Everyone there knows that language. There's no specific notes that need to be played within that chord. As long as that chord is played, it will work. And then there's what we call a chord progression. A classic chord progression would be a 1, 4, 5. And a simple way to explain that is you have the first note in the scale, which would, let's say, a C in the C scale. The fourth note is an F, and the fifth note is a G. And how that sounds when you're listening to music, let's say it's like talking. So the C, the home chord, is home base. But then you might carry it on and go into what would be the fourth of the chord, which doesn't need to be higher in tone, but it has a little bit more of a like you're getting into a story. And then lastly, the fifth of the chord, that one it comes as a question that leaves you hanging and usually leads back to the one or the C, the bass note of the chord. This is very simple, and quite often musicians like to deviate from this simple formula in order to make the music more interesting. But if you look at the music of Bob Dylan, for example, some of his most famous songs are very simple 1-4-5 progressions that simply repeat throughout the whole song. All right, so let's look at a couple of different kinds of music that come up in the lesson in one way or another. So classical music. Classical music is a wonderful form of music, and it can be challenging to some who are not familiar. I encourage you to watch the videos that introduce the different types of classical music and to listen deeply to the introductions provided in the videos, because classical music has such a rich texture to it. Some of my earliest memories are falling asleep at the symphony when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I can remember that background music, the rich music filling the room as if in a dream. But what about also music of the rest of the world? In our chapter, when they talk about the basic intervals of the musical scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, like that, they say that it's universal, and I would say that it is not. In the raga music, which we also have a video about, in raga music, the scale itself is different. So that often when a Western musical appreciator, when someone who is familiar with Western music listens to a raga, they hear what we would call a wrong note. In fact, a professional musician and I were listening together to a raga singer, and he said, "Oh, that singer is so off key." But no, there are notes between the notes that they use in raga, so it's really a completely different scale. Now, raga is the traditional music, classical music of India. So let's also look at what about jazz music? Now, in the chapter, I think they said that jazz was born in New Orleans, went to Chicago, and then on from there. As a person who spends a whole lot of time listening to jazz music in Kansas City, I will tell you that there's a rich tradition of that music pretty close by, really just down the road. And the definition of jazz is so varied and so vast, like many forms of music. There's the bebop or free jazz, which some people find hard to listen to. I admit, it challenges me. But then there's swing and more rhythmic jazz, which is a little bit more traditional version and has such a rich complexity to it. Many of these musicians are true masters in that many times I've seen them meet, having never met before, shake hands, go to the stage, and perform before thousands of people, and to carry it off well. That's part of the tradition of the music, is to just get out there and play. Now, what is demanded in that is, of course, deep listening. The best musician in the jam circle or in the jazz ensemble is that musician who can listen, who can play quietly, who can let another play and then find their place in the one statement that is the group music. Another form of music that I did not see in the chapter in the book this week was what we'll call roots music. And this graphic, of course, doesn't begin to show it, but I will give you the idea. Roots music is a very broad term, one that has come into vogue in recent years. Roots music, that can be music going back to Africa. That could be music from South America. Traditional Southern bluegrass is often called roots music. Any music that goes back to traditions, often traditions that are not written down but are only passed down through the music, and brings it forward, brings that tradition forward into today, that could be called roots music. So in celebration of the wide variety of traditions and cultures in our society, I would say we honor roots music. One rather popular form of roots music we'll call folk music. And this is the great folk musician Pete Seeger playing, it looks like it's in the 1960s, surrounded by a group of avid listeners. If you break down Pete Seeger's music, again, it is very, very simple. He almost always plays in major keys, and he uses the 1-4-5 progression that I mentioned earlier. As a songwriter, I've often thought that it won't be a good song. It's like it's too simple if it's just a 1-4-5 progression. And yet if you use that simple formula of making a statement, carrying it forward, and coming to the question, back to resolution, that's really how a 1-4-5 will function in a song. So now that you know that, maybe you can hear it. So let's go from Pete Seeger holding up his banjo for all to see to rock and roll, which is again a vast term covering a wide variety of musical forms. But often, rock and roll started as an evolution of jazz music, of rhythm and blues, but really it's toe tapping music. I didn't mention blues, but that's mentioned in our text and is another really valuable form of music. And of course, it wouldn't be complete if we didn't bring up hip hop. And everyone has different musical opinions, and I totally respect hip hop and I love the movement and the feel of it, but I resonate with other styles of music more. However, I bet that there's plenty of people that are listening right now that find that is their primary source of music, and it makes you want to get up and move. So it's an absolutely valid art form that's continuing to develop even as I speak. And lastly, I would like to suggest that the best way to experience music is to make music. The text talks about listening and about hearing, but does it also talk about music making, about the power of being in a group of singers singing in harmony, about the feeling of connection when playing rhythm or playing music and connecting with others? As someone who took up one of my instruments when I was past 40 years old and now performs it, I will encourage any of you who think someday I want to learn to play, just to pick it up and to practice. Because here's the theory: if you practice 20 minutes a day at least, and sometimes get lost in it and play a little longer, you can learn anything. Of course, having said that, musicians have always needed listeners, and it's not everyone's role in life to play. But I do encourage you all to be open to the power of live music in whatever way you are participating, as a deep listener, as a dancer, or as a musician, and to notice if music has just become a background noise in your life, and if so, I encourage you to find ways to bring it to the foreground and to celebrate one of the most ancient, shared art forms of humanity. All right then, thanks for listening.